Welcome back. This is Brighter Morning with Bo on MCTV, and I am Bo Tiwari. My guest this morning is Claire Fitzpatrick, President of BP in Trinidad and Tobago, and we'll talk with her now.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm very well. It's nice to see you again.
Yes, thank you very much for agreeing to be on Brighter Morning with Bo. And we'll start immediately with perhaps the most controversial issue having to do with the gas business in Trinidad and Tobago, and that is Atlantic Train 1. Now, I know that although that is a big controversial issue, it has very little to do with BP, and it has more to do with NGC's decision to make an investment in Train 1. But I want to clarify a couple of things. BP had problems with anticipated gas fines in 2019 and indicated this to the government so that there was knowledge that there would be problem with the supply of gas. And this was known by both BP and the government of Trinidad and Tobago. Is that true?
No, obviously I can't speak on behalf of Atlantic or any of the other stakeholders. I can, as you say, speak on behalf of BP. So yes, in 2019, we drilled some wells that we had hoped and anticipated would be able to deliver a sizable volume of gas to be able to enter into a new contract for Train 1. Unfortunately, in our business, we manage risk. That's basically a lot of what our business is about. And those wells did not, in fact, discover the gas that we had anticipated. So we were unable to enter into a new contract for Train 1. And yes, that was public knowledge in 2019, and that has continued to be the case. We continue to do all we can to maximise the production from our existing facilities and to progress new developments to offset the decline, because the gas fields, by their very nature, when you're producing them, then the volumes remaining declining. So you have to keep adding activities in order to just basically hold yourself flat, or to try and hold yourself flat. So that's the position we're in, and so yes, we were still unable to enter into a contract for Train 1.
For you, the decision not to invest in Train 1 would have been a business decision because you had contractual obligations on other trains that you had to fulfill. Is that not so? Is that correct?
Yes. With any gas contract, what we want to do is, again, as I mentioned, sort of, we're in the business of balancing risk. Things don't always go as you hope. What we want to try and do is make sure, do you have a line of sight to gas before you enter into a gas contract? So we previously had contracts across all of the trains and for NGC. With the Train 1 contract expiring, we didn't have gas, nor did we have a contract. We do have existing contracts that were entered into many years ago with both Trains 2, 3 and 4, as well as the NGC. Therefore, they are the contractual commitments that we look to fill first. And we're actually short of gas even on those trains. So I'm actually paying penalties at the moment for not having enough gas to meet all of my commitments across all of the existing trains and NGC.
Okay, so whatever decisions that were made by NGC in consultation with the government basically were independent decisions of that entity having nothing to do with the business decisions of BP and I guess to some extent Shell, but you speak for BP. So I will leave that matter now that we've clarified that it was known that we won't have the gas in 2019. It was a business decision by BP. It was also a business decision by NGC independent of that. And BP had obligations in terms of contracts on other trains which it had to fulfill and could not, knowing the situation, make any commitments to Train 1. Is BP now involved in discussions with the government of Trinidad and Tobago on the restructuring of Atlantic LNG? What can you say publicly that I know that there are discussions and negotiations and that not everything can be talked about, but what can you say publicly about the restructuring of basically Atlantic LNG as a company?
Well, Atlantic is actually three companies currently, and those three companies have different shareholders. They have very different commercial constructs and legal constructs, and the purpose of restructuring Atlantic is to simplify all of that. And this is around creating a single entity which has same owners, same commercial and legal construct, which will then enable Atlantic to focus on becoming and retaining its position as a world-class LNG facility and really focus on operational excellence and not be sidetracked by any commercial matters or differences between the shareholders across the different legal entities, the different trains. That's a complexity that actually detracts from what Atlantic do best. So that's what the purpose of restructuring is about, is to simplify it, to allow them to focus on what we know they can do best and just make it a little easier to actually run that business. And that makes sense for what the future looks like relative to what the past had looked like as Atlantic was getting developed over the last 20 years. So that's the purpose. So yes, we are in negotiations with all of the shareholders with the aim of that outcome. And we also recognise that from a country perspective, it's very important that the government is able to position itself so that the people of Trinidad and Tobago are getting a fair return for the risk that they are taking in Atlantic. And that's also part of the discussion. That's something that all the shareholders acknowledge, that this is around making sure that the end result is both fair and equitable for all stakeholders, recognising that the government has its interests held through the NGC, but they have to protect their interests in the same way as investors, whether it's NGC or BP, want to make sure that we're getting an appropriate return for the risk that we're taking and have taken in that particular business.
Yeah, so the discussion about what is being termed unitization, in which all four trains become part of Atlantic, the company, and the company Atlantic LNG is run as a single company. It presents no difficulty. It's just a question of what are the terms of negotiations as we deal with this restructuring for unitization. Is that correct?
That's a yes and a no. All negotiations have complexity. That doesn't matter whether you're negotiating something with your teenage children or whether you're actually negotiating a business transaction. So there will be some difficulties and there will be some points of challenge as we work our way through this, because we are changing its current construct and its current setup to something different. But is it entirely doable? Yes, I believe it is.
I think the thinking is, and that is on the table, that running Atlantic LNG as one company, you're going to get greater levels of efficiency and effectiveness, but you are also going to be able to do things which make the company and the LNG operations more palatable to sustainability and COP26 decisions and so on. Is that correct?
I think it will help. Certainly, Atlantic as an LNG facility has to be thinking about, and as the shareholders, we are all thinking about what is the roadmap for Atlantic in terms of lowering its emissions. All part of industry has to be thinking about how do we lower the emissions associated with it. We know that 70% of emissions come from industry, transport, power, the energy sector, and the products that that sector generates. The other reason why we want to be focused on it is not only is it around what's Atlantic's role in Trinidad's roadmap to a lower carbon future, we're also looking at our products. And that is, we produce LNG, and LNG is then exported to markets around the world. As markets around the world introduce different regulations and expectations about the carbon footprint of products that are imported, we want to make sure that Atlantic LNG remains competitive in the global market, and that's competitive both in a dollar sense, but it's also competitive in terms of a carbon footprint sense. So having a single entity does make decision-making easier for us to actually support Atlantic in the journey that they are wanting to go on, and we all want them to go on, in terms of lowering its carbon footprint. So definitely having one entity rather than three does make things easier.
Does lowering the carbon footprint is an important factor in competitiveness globally as we go forward in energy? Isn't that so? And a country can make a decision based on its own laws and rules that basically debar another company from exporting to that company and make a preference for another company. Is that correct?
That's certainly some of what we're starting to see, particularly from the European Union, but it will also increasingly, over time, apply to other jurisdictions as well. So so you can have a country or countries that introduce some rules that make the carbon footprint part of a determinant. It's not got to the point where it would be barred from going in, but if you're the buyer and have an option of buying some LNG, which has a lower carbon footprint, which is effectively cheaper than the one with a higher carbon footprint, then you're putting the one with the higher carbon footprint at a disadvantage. And that's really what we want to do, is make sure that Atlantic remains globally competitive. Now, that's not something that's going to change tomorrow, but equally, it takes time to lower the carbon footprint. So we need to be in action now, so that in 3, 4, 5 years' time, Atlantic is still well positioned to be globally competitive.
Okay, now let's talk about BP a little bit. Where is BP, the global corporation, headed as an energy company? And what kind of timelines are we talking about? I know that from the BP point of view, BP has articulated that it wants to get to net zero by 2050. How does BP see itself as an energy company, and how does that align, let's say, in Trinidad and Tobago, and in terms of BP's strategy here? So the global and the local.
Very big question to answer. So last year, BP launched its new purpose and ambition. That was around, as we described it, to reimagine energy for people and the planet. And that's recognizing that on a global scale, the world is going to need more energy as we move forward. But it's going to want energy that is clean, reliable, and affordable. So I can describe it as half the world wants more energy and half the world wants clean energy, and everyone wants it to be reliable and affordable. So by setting our new purpose, we then developed strategies and aims. As you say, we want to be a net zero company by 2050 or sooner. If we can make it sooner, then we will definitely be doing so. And that's recognising we acknowledged climate change and the impact of emissions on climate more than 20 years ago. And we have been investing in it ever since. Now, you could argue that some of our earlier investments were ahead of their time, because the world wasn't yet really thinking about climate change and how do we get to a lower carbon future. What is the impact of climate change on many countries, and particularly sitting here in Trinidad, I'm acutely aware of the impact of changing weather patterns, rising sea levels, and the consequences of that from a society's perspective. So BP also recognises that some people view us as the problem. We very much view ourselves as we want to be part of the solution. Companies like us don't set ourselves targets and ambitions and hold ourselves to account on actually taking action to reduce our carbon footprint, then the world isn't going to be able to get there. There's absolutely roles for green companies that just focus on renewable energies, but there aren't enough of them, and they don't have the scale yet. You actually need industrial companies to also be saying, you know what, we need to do something about our own operations as well. So we do view ourselves as part of the solution, and that's in two ways. One is around what is it we need to do about our own operations, and then also what is it that we can do to help support countries, cities, other companies, because no one company is going to be able to solve this for the world. It's going to require all of us, and there's a role that all of us can play. So we've also set ourselves targets and aims which will drive our strategy and our business decision making. Because if we've said we want to be net zero by 2050 or sooner, then our actions and decisions need to be in support of that. And it is a transition. It's not a yes and no today, tomorrow. It's a transition over time. But we've also set ourselves some targets externally for 2030. 2050 seems like a long time away. So we need to be able to demonstrate that we're making progress towards that. So when I then think about what does that then mean for Trinidad, a couple of key things here. One is the transition to net zero. Gas plays a huge, huge role. It is the transition fuel that enables us to move away on a global basis from coal and oil. It also solves intermittency issues with renewables. So gas is going to have a pivotal role in the global transition. So Trinidad, as a unique from a BP perspective, as a gas business, is well placed, and we're going to be producing hydrocarbons for decades and decades to come. We are also looking, though, at what do we do about our own operations. So I'm really, really proud of the team at BP on enthusiastically going after how do we reduce emissions from our own operation. And they are coming up with all sorts of ideas, from small things to big things. And nothing is left untouched in terms of, can we do it a different way? Is there a way we can reduce the footprint of that activity? And we have taken out huge amounts already. It gets harder as you move forward because you've taken out the ones that maybe are a little easier. I don't want to underestimate the effort the team's put in already, but we will continue on that journey. And then in addition to that, we're also looking at what is a role that we can play in, from a country perspective, in helping Trinidad move to lower carbon. And as you know, we are part of the consortium with Lightsource BP and Shell for Trinidad's first industrial scale solar project, and we're hoping that that can complete and then hopefully get into operations by the start of 2023. So we're playing a role both in terms of our own operations and in terms of renewable energy, but it's really important to recognise that gas is absolutely pivotal in the world's transition. Therefore, Trinidad's gas business is well placed to support not only the country's transition, but the world's transition.
Okay, so you share the Prime Minister's view then that gas is a clean fuel and that it has a future in the transition that the world is trying to make to cleaner fuels and to get to net zero. Secondly, you are also involved as Lightsource BP in a transition in Trinidad and Tobago where we are going to try to entrap solar energy to contribute about 10% of our energy needs. And these things you are working collaboratively. You are working as a company to meet your own objectives, but you are also working collaboratively with government to achieve certain national objectives for Trinidad and Tobago. Is that correct?
Very much this is a space for collaboration and partnership. As I said, no one company is going to be able to solve this for any country or city location. So it is around how do we partner to achieve common objectives. So the country has a stated reduction plan that it wants to achieve. We have our stated plan for us as a company. Therefore, those two can work together. That's when things work really well, is when we have made our aims and ambitions public, therefore our business decisions are lined up with that. But countries also have ambitions and targets, and they can then establish a policy framework to achieve those targets. That's when companies can then say, okay, if that's what the country is trying to achieve, this is the solutions that we can bring to help the country actually achieve that. And you can definitely then work in partnership and collaboration to meet the mutual objective that we're all trying to do in terms of minimise the impact of climate change on us as societies, our livelihoods.
Based on Paris, BP made certain commitments, which has basically it's what the company is espousing today as its objectives. But did BP make any further commitments in the COP26 forum that the world should know about? Was there anything else?
26 was a gathering of global leaders who were thinking about things from people's perspective, so from their citizens and their societies. And it was around them deciding what more commitments or what further clarifications were needed on how is the world going to move to a more sustainable outcome in terms of climate change. And the Prime Minister travelled to the UK for the purposes of that. It wasn't a gathering of corporate leaders. So BP wasn't making any additional statements, commitments, etc., associated with COP26. That wasn't the purpose from a corporate perspective for any corporate. So for us, our statements were made last year when we went out with our ambition to be net zero by 2050 or sooner. And as we have over last year laid out for our interim targets and milestones in terms of our progression on that journey. So for me, COP26 was very much around what were the countries globally going to be doing and how far were they prepared to go. And there's mixed views as to how successful that has been, particularly around coal. But I think we've still got a lot more to see about what's actually coming out of that. For me, BP is very much around having laid out what we want to do, but also having laid out the milestones, it's actually then being able to demonstrate, are we achieving these milestones? So we have milestones in 2025, 2030, and we are being very transparent about how we're progressing against that. Now, each entity inside BP, so BP Trinidad, we have targets as well on an annual basis that we have to have plans, we have to deliver, and we are measured against that. As are we achieving it? If yes, great, can we go further? If not, why not? What support do we need from the wider organisation to help us achieve that? So that's the role that the corporates are playing. So no new things from BP beyond what we laid out last year, but it's great to know that the world leaders are getting together and talking about these things. But I recognise that every country has its own challenges, therefore having a standard approach is not going to be workable. Each country has to work out based on its citizens' needs, its economic circumstances, what pace can it move at?
Yes. Now, in terms of what we've been talking about here, BP is committed to natural gas exploration. They are committed to continuing the discussion for the restructuring of Atlantic LNG. And they are committed to working with government for a percentage of investment to generate renewable energy to help the country to transform. Could you confirm that these three things are true? And secondly, did the discussion with the Prime Minister, with your leaders in London at headquarters, raise anything that is outside of the three issues that I've just mentioned?
Okay, I'll deal with the three issues and then I'll come to the the meetings in London. So yes, we confirmed that we are continuing to develop the resources in our acreage. So we've obviously brought on the Matapal project this year. Cassia compression is on schedule for the middle of next year. The next project we're working on is the SIP project. We are also going to resume the sort of near-field drilling programs that we suspended in 2019 after our disappointing results. So we will hopefully have a rig back in country, back into next year to start that drilling program. And we still have some exploration prospects in the Columbus Basin that we want to progress. We're also still working with BHP on the deep water that's currently under appraisal drilling, and we're looking forward to the new bid rounds that the Minister has indicated will come in the early part of next year. So we are still committed to developing the gas resources, because as I said, we view gas as a very pivotal part of the transition to a lower carbon future. So we're still committed to exploration and development. Recognising the Columbus Basin is mature, so it's getting more complex, more challenging, but we do think there's still potential there, and we're very interested and excited around the possibilities from deep water, and in time, cross-border gas as well. Yes, we want to support Trinidad on its journey to a lower carbon future, both through our solar project, but also through, for example, with the other stakeholders, what's the role of Atlantic and how do we support Atlantic on its lowering its carbon emissions. So that's kind of, Trinidad we still view as a key part of BP's future. But the competitive landscape is getting tougher, not just from a carbon perspective. As we transition, we will move more of our investment dollars out of traditional hydrocarbons into renewables, and we've made a public statement of by 2030, 40% of our current production will be down 40% of current production, which means roughly about 40% of our investment dollars will move. So we increase our low carbon energy investment from about 500 million a year up to 5 billion between now and 2030, which means that the competition for dollars is going to get harder. So we in Trinidad need to work to keep our business competitive so that we can still attract BP's investment dollars. And that's going to get harder and harder. So that's the business challenge for us that we're up for, because we believe in it. In respect of the meeting with the Prime Minister, the purpose of that meeting wasn't around decisions, specific commitments, agreements, etc. It was building on the long and good relationship and partnership that BP has with the government of Trinidad and Tobago. It was to talk about what our future developments look like. It was to talk about, the fact that we are moving in our ambitions as a company. How does that impact Trinidad? And to reaffirm, as I've just said, the pipeline of activity that we want to progress, provided we can make sure that it's competitive. The purpose wasn't around any big decisions, etc. And there was nothing particularly to do at that point. Yes, we are in restructuring conversations, but they weren't to a point where we're signing agreements yet, and hopefully that will come in the not too distant future.
Okay. Claire, I want to thank you very much for being so forthright in your responses. I've got to take a break here for commercials, but when I come back, I want to put this question to you. You can reflect on it for when we come back, and it is this. BP wants to get into deep water drilling where the prospects seem good. The incentive regime created by the government of Trinidad and Tobago is critical in this, and BP has to think about how it manages its investment for risk and reward. BP has argued in the past that looking at the value chain carefully could make these discussions more rational. How are the discussions going, and is the issue of the value chain in natural gas exploration and its consequences and its various points along the chain, is that on the table? We'll come back to that after the break.
Welcome to Lifetime Solutions, where you can trust your roof to us. Our services include custom fabrication, steel framing, roofing installation, on-site roll forming, roofing maintenance and services. Call 223-ROOF or 223-7663 for a quote today or visit our website www.lifetimesolutionst.com. Lifetime Solutions. You can trust your roof to us. Call 223-ROOF or 223-7663 for a quote today or visit our website www.lifetimesolutionstt.com.
As businesses adapt to the new normal, let Magic Mist take care of your cleaning and sanitization needs with our COVID-19 BSCAI internationally certified technicians. With over 43 years of protecting the health of our nation, you can trust us to ensure your building remains safe, healthy, and functional. Give us a call today at 638-6675 or 332-5522. Magic Mist Services Limited, your total facilities management solutions provider.
Learn all about agriculture. Green Corner with Akanath Singh. Tuesdays and Thursdays at 1:30 p.m. Green Corner with Akanath Singh.
Welcome back. This is Brighter Morning with Bo. I am Bo Tiwari. You are watching on MCTV, Multicultural TV. And our guest this morning is the president of BP, Claire Fitzpatrick. I asked you the question before we left, which is that you want to drill because under the right conditions it can be lucrative. The country needs the gas because it's important for us and our future with BP. And there are negotiations going on. And part of the issue of the negotiations is how much Trinidad and Tobago gets out of the value chain and how much BP is able to get. Can you talk about that a little bit? Hello? Do we have a problem on... Do we have a problem?
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, I think we're getting her back.
Okay. So the whole question around the value chain is an important one because we have a thriving upstream gas business and we have a downstream business. And we also have NGC in that mix as well. And it's important that we find a way that all of them can still be viable businesses. Now, the challenge that we have is, as I mentioned, the Columbus Basin is a mature basin, so it's more expensive to find and develop those resources. When I look to deep water, I am optimistic about the potential of deep water, and that's all going to come down to scale, because deep water is a lot more expensive to develop than shallow water. So the challenge is, which is why I'm doing scale, like how do we develop it in a way that makes the whole energy gas value chain still viable? So it is around, well, looking at where are the areas that can become more efficient, where are the areas that there is leakage of value to both the country as well as to companies, and what can then be done about that. So that's work which the government is undertaking. You know that they've announced the gas strategies, they're doing some work in that space, and we've yet to see what ideas and possibilities come out of that. So that for me is that, yes, it's very interesting, it's very relevant. I very much view that as what can I do as a business? And for me, what I need to focus on is how do I make my business as efficient and as competitive as possible so that we're in a position to have developments that attract capital and then actually do develop the gas. So that's, I can focus on what is it that I can actually control, influence, so that we are bringing more gas to the market. Now, these developments take a long time, so deep water, for example, that'll be 5-6 years before that gas molecule is flowing. So we also need to think about how do we bridge between now and then. But I am hopeful that those developments will come, and while BHP are doing the appraisal wells right now, I'm hoping with the new exploration rounds, there will be more discoveries in the future, and that is, I refer to it as the next wave of gas, but it will be the next evolution of Trinidad as a gas-producing country.
Okay, you see at the present time, when you look at what you are involved in, you probably have gas life for about 5 or 7 years, but with deep water, that can be significantly expanded. And you also mentioned just now that at some point in time you see yourself involved in cross-border. So how do you see your timeline and your involvement in Trinidad and Tobago into the future? Are we talking about 1 decade, 2 decades, 3 decades? How are you looking at that? I know that BP's view of itself in the world would be for a century-long company and a century after that. But in Trinidad and Tobago, how do you see yourself?
We still see ourselves as having a long-term potential. So even the Columbus Basin, although it's declining, so the volume of gas that we get out in any one year, it gets smaller and smaller. The actual production we view is there's still going to be gas flowing from the Columbus Basin for decades and decades to come. If we then add in deep water, it's difficult to say how long that might be, particularly when I think about the new bid rounds, because nothing's discovered on that yet. So that's around believing in the potential. And if you think about the Columbus Basin being producing for 30, 40 years, so there's no reason to think if you move to deep water that basin wouldn't have something like that. And then when I think about the possibilities of a cross-border, obviously I would love to be part of that. When I think about it from Trinidad's perspective as opposed to a particular company, cross-border gas, when I think about Venezuela, the most logical place for Venezuelan gas to be developed, the easiest, would be through Trinidad. Now, there are all sorts of political issues there, so that's not something that we can do right now. I'm hopeful in time, just don't know when, that will change. Equally, when I look at the subsurface, then what are the potential into Barbadian waters? And again, logically, that would come back through to Trinidad. So it's difficult to give a definitive time other than I think the broader basins here have potential for a long time. And the challenge is making sure that those molecules are competitive globally, whether that's going into LNG or whether it's going into the petchem industry, so that Trinidad gas gets produced to the benefit of not only the companies but also the country, and that is a sustainable economic driver for the future. But I'm also very keen to see Trinidad diversified. Now, I can think about it in terms of there's different types of diversification, one of which is still in the form of energy. And that is, as I think about the world and its decarbonisation journey, It's thinking about, yes, there's renewables, which can then substitute. For me, renewables is a great story, particularly at the moment, because the more we can introduce renewables, then less gas is used to generate power, and that gas can then get monetised for the benefit of the country, and putting it into either petchems or LNG. But also I think about things like hydrogen, and how do Trinidad maybe become a hydrogen exporter, so it may be in time that Trinidad's exporting energy that's in a different form to what it currently does in the form of petchems and LNG. And I think Trinidad is also placed well to be able to think about what's that sort of role that it can play from a global perspective.
Okay, what you have said there is very interesting, and I want to take you back though to this link between natural gas and NGC. Natural gas and Atlantic LNG. It will take 1 TCF to give life to 1 train in NGC, let's say for about Atlantic LNG for about 20 years. So in your deep water arrangement, and at some point in time, any arrangements you might be involved in cross-border gas, you really have to get about 4 TCF to keep the 4 trains going simultaneously and concurrently for 20 years. Based on your intelligence about deep water, is that possible from deep water if the conditions are right in fiscal terms for you?
Possible question to answer until we see what's in the bid rounds, until you actually do exploration activity, until you actually know what's there. So at the moment, I view it as I see potential, and that means I'm optimistic. But until you actually do the activity, drill it, prove it up, know, and it's still a risk outcome, what you think you've got, then it's only at that point that you can say, okay, so if this is how much gas I think I've got, therefore, what's the capacity that I then need to be able to then produce it, and then the contracts that you would want to enter into. So for me, this is very much around the potential. And to realise that potential, obviously, the licence rounds have to have competitive terms in them in order to attract companies like BP to bid on them. And then there's a lot of work to be done before you're in a position to answer the question of how much gas do we have, if we think we have, therefore, what's the capacity, and more importantly then, how much am I able to contract, and therefore what do I need in Atlantic? So it's not something that we can actually answer at this point in time.
Okay, even on the issue of Lightsource BP though, and its partnership with NGC and the government and so on in this particular project, we have a challenge in Trinidad and Tobago, which is that we produce 10%, and we have a problem because of TGU, that is to say Trinidad and Tobago. This has nothing to do with you, and the contracts that TNTech have entered into. So we can produce the renewables, but we've got to find a way of getting it on the grid. We produce the solar energy, we've got to get it on the grid. Does that place, that kind of discussion and argument place a kind of limitation on BP as to what it can do in Trinidad and Tobago to help transform the country to cleaner energy? In other words, do we have a national problem that stands in the way of what you might want to do?
I don't view it as standing in the way of what we're wanting to do with Lightsource BP with the current Project Lara, as it is called. I recognise that contracts that exist for electricity are problematic in terms of there's a commitment for more electricity than is needed, and that has then caused some people to question, well, why would we then want to do a renewable project which is adding more into the electricity market? And the reason why that is still a good economic decision for the government is because it means that less gas is used to develop the electricity, because 10% can come from renewables, which means those gas molecules can then be monetized in a different way. And that actually means that it is economically beneficial for the country to have the renewable energy in the mix. Going forward, some of the challenges that we as Trinidad would have is solar projects require a lot of land. Now, I know when I kind of drive through Port of Spain or when I'm driving over to Miaro, Trinidad is blessed with huge amounts of beautiful, beautiful forests. We're not going to be taking them down. Therefore, the ability to expand solar by a huge amount is restricted from an industrial scale. There's lots of things we can probably all do on a domestic level, using our rooftops, etc. But there's also one of the other types of renewables are low carbon energies. So there will still be opportunities, I think, for some more solar activity. I know that there are companies that are looking at what wind energy might play in the mix. And then that's also, as I mentioned earlier, that's the role potentially hydrogen might play in the mix. So I don't view it as a limitation. I just think there are some different challenges that as a country we need to work through. How do we make our transition to a lower carbon future? The issue around TNT that exists, contracts, you can to sanction a contract. It's around how do you find solutions that help the transition in a way that is still economically beneficial from a country perspective.
Okay, I'm just going to ask you two more questions and we are going to close the discussion. And again, I want to thank you. At the beginning, you said that you would be willing to answer any question, and I really, really feel that you've been very generous and open in your answering of the questions. On this matter of deep water, let's say we were able to get through all the negotiations and BP were beginning to drill. One of the problems we are seeing in Guyana, for instance, as they drill offshore, is that all the produce from the drilling is going into tankers that leave the shore without any direct involvement of Guyana in the process. And one of the problems here has always been, how do we get the country involved in not just reaping the financial benefits in terms of taxes, but how do we get the benefits in terms of platform construction? We've had problems with that. And how do we get the benefits in terms of integrating some of the Trinidad and Tobago companies and workers into the value chain of the process? Will that be a consideration if you got the opportunity to drill in the deep waters of Trinidad and Tobago?
The issue of local content is always something that is front of mind for us. And I do describe this to our supplier and contractor community. If I can get something delivered in Trinidad, constructed in Trinidad, built, whatever the skills and technology mixed in there, if I can get that to the same safety standard, quality and price that I could get it from an other country, why would I not be giving that to Trinidad? So the question is, how do Trinidad suppliers and contractors make sure that they are competitive on both quality, safety, as well as cost, so that they are able to compete with companies from elsewhere? Because it's, to me, it makes no sense. Of course, if I can get all what I need here for the right standard and quality, well, I'm not going to go elsewhere. So it is around then, and Trinidadian suppliers and contractors face exactly the same challenges as I do around global competitiveness, because we are a global business. When I think about deep water developments are very different to shallow water. Yes. So I'm encouraging the Trinidadian supply chain to be starting to think about what would it take to develop a deep water business, what skills are needed, because deep water development elsewhere in the world, so you can look and see, okay, well, that's kind of what goes into them, and therefore what capacity and capability should Trinidadian companies be thinking about starting to build now so that they are in fact competitive for the activities that will be undertaken in the event that we do have a successful deep water basin development over the next decade. So that for me is the challenge. So I would like to see Trinidadian companies compete. We do see Trinidadian companies compete, but we also do see examples where they're just not competitive. And I particularly, when I think about some of our smaller companies here, is also encouraging them to think about what sort of alliances or collaborations that they might want to do with other Trinidadian companies, so that on a combined basis, they are able to compete with a global company, where they're bringing different skills together. And we have seen some examples where that has happened, and which is great to see. And we've also seen some examples, both in my own business, but also when I look to some other companies out there, where we have some Trinidadian companies being successful globally. So it's not that it can't be done, but it does need to have a global lens to it, and not just, well, I'm a Trinidadian company, therefore I deserve it. But there are some great Trinidadian companies here, and we enjoy working with Trinidadian companies. It gives me far more pleasure to think that there's local content and that money is remaining in the Trinidadian economy than it's going to the US or China.
Yes, well, okay, so it's up to us. I thought that was fair and clear and forthright. And I'm going to close with this question now. In any discussions going forward, the government government of Trinidad and Tobago will have an interest in NGC and its sustainability, and NGC itself is proceeding to transform itself. Also, the government would have an interest, perhaps because of NGC's interest in some of the downstreamers, in ensuring to a large degree the sustainability of the downstream industry in Trinidad and Tobago. And the government has an interest in renewables, and you are part of that. They have an interest, they have declared an interest in getting into hydrogen. I don't know if you are part of that, you can say, or whether you are part of the discussion. But do these things present particular challenges for you in which you have to make decisions about BP's profitability and sustainability that sometimes clash or contend with the interests of the government of Trinidad and Tobago in these matters?
Again, there's various parts to that. NGC has a role to play, and I both recognise and respect that across all elements, and no company stands still over decades and decades. So NGC are reviewing and evolving their business model in line with what's happening both in the country and in the world, and I would expect that the same as BP does that. Specifically in reference to the hydrogen question, we are not involved in any of the hydrogen activity here in Trinidad. We are very involved in hydrogen around the world, where we see some scale markets, and we have an objective of we would like to secure about 10% of market share by about 2030. So I'm very interested in watching what's happening here. I'm not saying that we wouldn't be involved in the future, but I'm hugely supportive of the activities that are underway, because I think it's a great thing and it's a great opportunity from a country perspective. In terms then of where anything might be in conflict, I think I mentioned earlier, where countries and companies have aims around the transition and what their lower carbon objectives are, and you can then get a policy framework around that, then there's huge alignment, because we'll be looking at what are the business opportunities for us that would help meet our objectives and the government's objectives. And like any business, it has to make business sense. And it's not conflict, there's always, like I mentioned in a negotiation, there's always points of tension as parties are trying to find what's the win-win space, that both parties are able to meet their stakeholders' objectives. And that's around adult negotiation, finding where there is the opportunities, the space, and that's around dialogue, and being willing to have open and frank dialogue, and really just focusing on what is the end objective and how do we get to it. So there's a difference between conflict and tension. And I don't see conflict, but if a negotiation doesn't have any tension, it's probably not going to get as good an outcome as it should do. So I view that as normal business, and that's how it is anywhere in the world.
Okay, I want to thank you, Claire Fitzpatrick, for what I consider a really wonderful interview. I want to thank you for taking the time to be here. I hope you will come back on another occasion where we can discuss some other things. And I want to say good luck to BP and good luck to Trinidad and Tobago as we move forward. Thank you so much for being part of Brighter Morning with Bo. This is Brighter Morning with Bo. Thank you for watching. We've been talking to Claire Fitzpatrick of BP. She is the president of BP, a very able lady, and she has spoken to us very straightforwardly about many of the issues having to do with BP in Trinidad and Tobago, in the world, and in the energy sector of Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you for watching. We'll take a break now, and when we come back, we go to the Minister of Tourism, and we'll have a conversation with him.